She will start her intervention on the concept of dignity and the various definitions for dignity which is specified by human rights discourse. هل تستطيعون الإصغاء إلي؟ هل تسمعون المترجمين؟ شكرا.
Palestine today and back at Birzeit in particular. I was just reflecting with some of my friends that it's been almost 3 years since I've been here, but that's physically only. Always feel like we're together with Birzeit and Palestine, no matter where we are, and thinking about what's happening in Palestine and the significance of what's happening in Palestine for us and for the broader events in the world. So today, my remarks are going to actually focus on the conventional story or the popular story or the usual story that's told about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, at least as it's told in human rights circles. And then I'd also like to look at some of the drafting history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in particular to focus on what's become the penultimate or often considered one of the most important provisions of the Universal Declaration. And that is Article 1, which reads in part with this beautiful language: all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. And then I'd like to just reflect at the very end with some initial thoughts about what that means, what the conventional story and the drafting history might tell us about the relationship between human rights and national narratives and the global order, and what that means for us today as people who want to claim human rights for perpetrators of human rights violations, but also for those who can be considered bystanders. I think we often tend to think of human rights as involving a rights claimant and a violator, but I think we also need to think about bystanders as well and their role. So my remarks today will touch on that a little bit. So I want to just say before I go into some of my remarks is that I'm looking at the drafting history not because I want to suggest that what the drafters thought about the Universal Declaration or their intentions of the Universal Declaration are what should control our understanding of it, but only that looking at some of the debates and understandings and tensions within the Universal Declaration when it was first drafted might give us a better sense of what the parameters we're actually working
المحاور
in today. So I'll start with just laying out some of the conventional story of the Universal Declaration and its significance, and then I'll go into some of the drafting history a little bit. So, the story that we're often told by scholars and practitioners is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights ushered in this era of what's sometimes called cascading human rights. It was a point in history when human rights became bigger and better. And this commitment to human rights, we're told, arose as a result of witnessing the horrors after World War II, genocide, the Holocaust, tyranny, war, violence. And through the Universal Declaration, the international community, composed of a diverse group of states that represent different politics, different cultures, different histories, vowed that a new era, guided by the overarching value of human dignity, would lead to a better future in which individual rights would be increasingly respected and protected. Right? That's the usual story. And those who tell this story often contend that the drafters agreed on the content and the value of human dignity, they set out a group of rights, civil, political, social, economic, etc., that would give meaning to a life lived in dignity. And that was their purpose, that was their overarching purpose. And the state, in this view or this story, is posited as the vehicle or the means through which international human rights would be delivered to the people. Or, in other words, the state would be the vehicle for human dignity. And the state would be a vehicle for human dignity, at least in the legal sphere, in two ways. And we've already discussed some of these ways, so I won't say too much about it. The first is through various international human rights mechanisms. After the Universal Declaration, there were conventions that were drafted, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, for example. And within these conventions, there were mechanisms that individuals and states could use to bring forward their rights claims. So things like communications or complaints by individuals, um, um, moving into more the present era, things like prosecutions through the International Criminal Court. So that was supposed to be one vehicle at the international level to give effect to some of the rights in the Universal Declaration. And then, as was already discussed this morning, the other was through the domestic implementation of international through human rights law, particularly through constitutions, but also through human rights mechanisms. So, staying with the conventional story, violations of rights are understood as aberrations, right? A move away from what otherwise is supposed to be this ongoing march towards the realization of the rights contained in the Universal Declaration. And the point behind the Universal Declaration was to make visible when people's rights were violated. Right? But this story of cascading human rights, I think, has a hard time explaining what's happening in much of the world today. Violence, war, racism, and other forms of suffering. And at least I feel like, and I know some of my colleagues and friends and family feel like somehow we've fallen off the human rights cliff, both in legal and political terms. So, this conventional story of human rights seems overly simplistic. As much as I, frankly, personally would like to believe in it, it just doesn't explain what's happening around us. And it also is not the story of human rights that we get when we look at the drafting history of the Universal Declaration. So I want to just turn to that for a minute and again focused on Article 1. So, first of all, the drafting history of the Universal Declaration, I think, makes very clear that the main objective of drafting the Universal Declaration was not through the prism of human dignity per se. The overarching objective or the purpose of the Universal Declaration was to secure stability in a divided world. And human dignity and human rights were, for the most part, understood instrumentally. And in fact, dignity wasn't even a concept that figured very prominently in at least the first version of the Declaration that was drafted and presented to the Human Rights Commission by the Human Rights Secretariat. What the Human Rights Secretariat did was they looked at various constitutions around the world and they compiled a list that they thought represented a universal or commonly agreed upon list, and they presented that to the Commission as what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights looked like. But there were two critics to this approach that was called this laundry list of approach of human rights. The two critics were the representatives of China and Lebanon. And the critics insisted that the Universal Declaration needed to identify that thing or that quality that differentiated human beings from other life forms and that bound us together as beings, as human beings, regardless of political, social, economic, historical differences, etc. And it was the Lebanese representative in particular who argued that the Universal Declaration should not be regarded in its drafting as a complete list of rights, but what might be called, and he didn't use this language, but it might be regarded more like a living tree, a document that gave us some concepts that we could expand upon and grow as our knowledge of people's needs and their circumstances grew. So the Chinese and the Lebanese representatives in particular argued for the inclusion of human dignity in the Universal Declaration. And their view was that human rights were things that all people, all human beings, were entitled to just by virtue of their being human, and that one of the reasons why you gave human rights or recognized human rights in, in individuals is that if you did that, it would lead to stability in nations. And if there was stability within states, rather, if there was stability within, there would be stability among. And as it happened, the representative from Lebanon was both the special rapporteur for the Commission on Human Rights, so had an important position coordinating, among other things, what was happening. But he was also one of three people appointed to the temporary drafting group that actually then revised the version of the Universal Declaration that was given by the Secretariat. And as one of three people, he had some pretty significant influence. And it was this version that introduced that Article 1, right? The one that says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. But there was objection to this article. And the main objection, there were several, but the main objection came from the representatives of South Africa. And the South Africans had a number of objections. And it has to be remembered that 1948 was, yes, when the Universal Declaration was adopted, but it was also the time that South Africa was starting to legalize and put into law apartheid, which had existed socially, but now it was becoming very clear and explicit and legalized. And the South African delegation made a number of objections, and one of them was that dignity was not a good concept to put in the Universal Declaration because it just simply promised too much. A life of dignity couldn't be delivered anywhere in the world, and it was better to just give a list of rights that could be realistic and practical, and that should be the end of the Universal Declaration. And as the delegate put it, it was, quote, after all, not the function of the committee to codify a whole philosophy of life. It was better to confine the declaration to those rights which were practical in the world as it was. And the South African delegation talked about the rights to freedom of movement and freedom of residence, and said that those rights could be seen as fundamental, or sorry, could not be seen as fundamental or a violation of dignity because it was contrary to South Africa's apartheid regime. Right? So this was the discussion, or part of the discussion that was being very openly had around the drafting. This is how the South African representative put it. They could not possibly accept the thesis that human dignity would be impaired if a person were told he could not reside in a particular area. Such a thesis would destroy the whole basis of the multiracial structure, that's the language that they used, the multiracial structure of the Union of South Africa, And it would certainly not be in the interests of the less advantaged Indigenous population. It had to be remembered that large tracts of the territory in that country had been set aside for the exclusive use and development of the non European population, and no European was permitted to acquire or occupy lands in that area. So, presenting rights violations, what are properly, I think, seen as rights violations, as somehow to the benefit of those people who were being oppressed under these violations. The South African delegation also objected that the concept of human dignity would give rise to unrealistic expectations that might be spun into political slogans and legal claims. And they recognized that even though the declaration was not a convention per se, but they worried that some might insist on interpreting its provisions in light of certain passages of the charter, for example, and that would try to turn what were these abstract statements into legal obligations. And so, really, what were they complaining about, or what were they worried about? They were worried that the declaration would cause people to dream, and it would lead them to wanting too much out of life and would eventually make them feel unsatisfied. So, in other words, human dignity, the promise of human dignity, would produce global instability. Okay? So, this is the discussion that's being had, and the rapporteur of the committee, in response, remembering that this is the person who's drafted the language of human dignity, reminded the South African delegate that the concept of human dignity had, in fact, been introduced in the United Nations Charter by another South African representative. Okay. So let's just pause for a minute and think about and take in the significance of this response. Lots of ways to interpret it, I suppose, but the way that it struck me is that the rapporteur's response to the South African delegation is that dignity was actually not as threatening to the South African order as the delegation might have feared. And this seems to me a very curious response because, again, it was at this very moment that both participating in the drafting of the Universal Declaration, that South Africa was actually entrenching apartheid in the law. So maybe at some level, the rapporteur was just being diplomatic. But if you read the drafting history, you see that diplomacy was not always highly valued in the exchange between these representatives. But regardless of the reason or the motivation of the response, South Africa eventually accepted the language of human dignity in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, the question I have is, how can that be? How can it be that the world's 5 minutes, okay? Thank you. No, that's okay. So, how can it be that the world's penultimate human rights document, the most translated, most celebrated human rights document, was created, right, and endorsed and accepted at the same time that the apartheid regime, right, was being put in place? And also, if we step out of the drafting history of the Universal Declaration for a minute and just again remind ourselves, like, or at least I will explicitly state that, of course, the Universal Declaration was drafted not only when apartheid was being put into place, but when half of the Palestinian population had been expelled or was being expelled from historic Palestine, and Israel was admitted into the United Nations. So, how do we explain these simultaneous events? That a moment at which an esteemed international organization proclaimed a universal language of rights at the same time that it effectively sanctioned the institution of a state premised on the utter disregard of those rights. Well, clearly, at one level, the answer is very obvious. The United Nations was being hypocritical. But I think the drafting history points at something that's a little bit more than hypocrisy at play. I think what it tells us is that the concept of human dignity, as encapsulated in that text, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, was at least since the very birth of the Universal Declaration conditioned or limited by national narratives. So in 1948, South Africa was confident that its national narrative of a multiracial state, as it called it, that separated racialized people into spaces for the benefit of all, that's the national narrative, would be acceptable to the global community. And it was given that message of acceptability by the Human Rights Commission largely through the failure of other state representatives to clearly condemn that apartheid regime. And Israel got the same message. And many people would argue, I would agree, that Israel remains confident that its narrative, the narrative it presented, namely that the serial systematic violation of Palestinian rights was necessary for its own survival, was acceptable to the global community. So this points obviously to some of the downsides of human rights that we've already talked about, but I'd like to suggest one other downside is that one of the things that the Universal Declaration did is it told us where to look and how to look to find legitimate human suffering. And the texts have shorn our civic capacity in many important respects in that they condition our understanding and our ability to see suffering. So, in other words, we tend to take suffering most seriously when it's recognized as a human rights problem. But what the Universal Declaration story, its drafting history, tells us or reminds us is that there are significant forms of systemic violence that have evaded human rights labeling from the very start. And there are, to be sure, many enemies of human rights, but the unwillingness or inability to understand the suffering of the other is one of them. And I'd like to propose that a national narrative that's compelling to its audience is a factor that determines whether someone else's suffering is seen or not seen, or whether it's regarded, if seen, as justifiable or not. And what do I mean by national narrative? I don't mean a nation or a state. What I mean by national narrative is the story or the autobiography of a state, the story that the state or the nation tells itself about its purpose and its reason for existence. The Commission on Human Rights accepted the South African and Israeli national narratives as compelling enough that they did not see, or at least could not collectively and confidently condemn, apartheid or mass expulsions as dignity violations. And the Commission, in this way, became a bystander to some very significant and egregious rights violations. One more minute. Okay. Let me just use my last minute by saying that this tension between dignity as, maybe I could call it dignity as empathy, right? Or rights as empathy, and dignity or rights as self interest, of course, carries through to this day. And they carry through in purportedly democratic societies that espouse human rights protections and have human rights constitutions, like Canada, for example. And those of you know the history of Canada and Indigenous peoples know that one of the things that has limited our ability to see the rights violations, genocide that's been committed against Indigenous peoples in Canada is our national narrative as a country that loves negotiation, that, unlike the United States, doesn't like violence. So I'm just offering that as a modern day example. And another example of how national narratives have limited our ability to see, even as we claim that human rights have defined and helped us understand our obligations as individuals and as collectives. So I suppose that the tragedy of the Universal Declaration was that it was supposed to help us see and understand suffering more fully. But its own story reveals the ongoing power of national narratives on our ability to see and understand, but it also tells us what's at stake for us now, today. What I think is at stake is not simply the question of yes to human rights or no to human rights, but the question of what limits our understanding of human rights in the first place, the preconditions of our knowledge, and how national narratives are part of that precondition and understanding. And then, just to bring it back to the theme of the conference, how do we, and when I say we, I'm actually thinking more about North America and outside of Palestine, how do we regard what's happening in Palestine, and what is our role as bystanders in thinking about questions of human dignity, the Universal Declaration, and Palestine in particular? Thank you.
شكرا ريم. قبل ما انتقل بدي اطلب منكم اللي
Before
مش
I
عم
move,
يستخدم الترجمه
those
يخفيها خلال الوقت اللي ما بيستعمله فيها عشان بس بيعمل صوت.
those who are not using the
المداخله
translator
الثانيه
kits,
جيسون بيكيت، والمداخله بتتعامل مع
it
السؤال عن
deals
دور حقوق الانسان في
with
ظل
the issue
الحل من
of
تغيير
human rights
الظلم اللي بيتم ممارستها، خلينا نقول
about
على بما انه بنحكي عن نظام حقوق انسان عالمي على الصعيد العالمي
accountability as being a sort of involvement, accountability as complicity.
اذا بتقدر
هل تستطيع أن تعرف على نفسك جيسون؟
Hi,
هو
my name is Jason.
جيسون.
Work in the American University in Cairo. I'm going to try and start this presentation in a very light way because about 3 minutes in, I think most of the room are going to hate everything that I say, and then it's going to go steadily downhill. Even worse is following such a thoughtful paper as Ream's with my rather disparate and polemic thoughts. So first of all, let's start with a few fun facts that came to mind while I was listening to Ream's paper. The South African delegation to the UNC, to the United Nations Charter, the chap that wrote the preamble to the United Nations Charter, probably the nicest short story in the history of international law, was a guy called Jan Smuts. And Jan Smuts is also famous for being the premier that introduced apartheid legally to South Africa. But he wasn't alone. While Eleanor Roosevelt was arguing for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, her husband's administration and succeeding administrations were actively excluding African Americans from the advances of the New Deal. And Roosevelt herself, Eleanor Roosevelt, when trying to get congressional support for the New Deal, wrote a really striking set of letters to a group of senators called the Southern Democrats. And in these letters, she promised, and I quote, "The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not an attempt to outlaw lynching by the back door." So human rights and the extrajudicial murder of African Americans were apparently fully compatible. Obviously, the American genocide of its native population was still continuing, as was the Canadian genocide of its native population. And if we bring it up to date, we see Canada's interesting relationship with human rights, where you have Justin Trudeau. He's sort of, for me, the perfect figure of human rights. He's suave, he's caring, he'll even wear native costumes in the correct occasions, go to smudge ceremonies, but he will not stop the exploitation of treaty lands for their their oil and gas resources. His foreign minister, whose name I forgot, is willing to categorically condemn Saudi Arabia for jailing female human rights activists, but at the same time refuse to even discuss the $15 billion arms sale that Saudi Arabia has with Canada. Um, Sorry, I said my notes were bad. So, having said that, I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. Yeah, for paying for me to come here. And particularly to thank Joyce Cashew for just making everything so easy and so comfortable. Uh, then comes the hard bit. Um, I don't like human rights. I really don't. That's not a joke. I actually don't like human rights. Um, I don't think that human rights should be universal. More importantly, I don't think that human rights can be universal. I don't think they were ever designed to be universal. And even more importantly, I honestly don't think that people want human rights. I don't think that peasants, farmers, and children in North India want the right to food, the right to education, or the right to healthcare. What they want is food, schools with teachers, hospitals with doctors and medicine. Not rights. The rights will not help them. They want stuff. And this is a fundamental problem because the stuff is not available for them. In 1915, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, "How can love of humanity appeal as a motive to nations whose luxury is built on the inhuman exploitation of human beings and who have been taught to regard those human beings as other than human?" More recently, Sven Lindqvist noted that we have created a lifestyle that makes injustice permanent and inescapable. And a theme which has come up in several of the speakers so far is the theme of hypocrisy. The hypocrisy of those who claim human rights and abuse human rights, the hypocrisy of the European Union, the hypocrisy of the international community. And these hypocrisies are all important, but I want to focus briefly on a different hypocrisy. I want to focus on my hypocrisy, which I suspect is also your hypocrisy. We claim to be good people. We claim to be moral beings. We claim to want, well, I don't claim to want universal human rights, but other people do claim to want universal human rights. And yet we sit here in clothes produced essentially by slaves, by women and girls exploited physically, emotionally, sexually in sweatshops in the brown parts of the world. We have smartphones and computers which rely on a mineral called coltan, which is almost invariably dragged out of the earth in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo by 8 to 10-year-old boys who are physically forced down unsafe mines, holes in the ground, to haul out the rocks that will be processed by other slaves in China into the materials that we need for our smartphones to be in communication with each other. If you happen, like me, to enjoy chocolate or coffee, then the chances are you enjoy the product of the labor of true slaves, children kidnapped from Senegal and the Gambia and sold for between 25 and 30 US dollars each to the cocoa farmers of Ghana and the Ivory Coast. And this hypocrisy, I think, is important. But I also think that this hypocrisy is what the human rights discourse exists to avoid. So the reason that I don't like human rights, and let me put this very bluntly, the reason I don't like human rights is that I think that they are working. I think human rights are doing exactly what they are meant to do. And what they are meant to do is to justify and naturalize the wealth and the privilege of those who have wealth and privilege, and to justify and to naturalize the suffering, the lack, the loss, the oppression of others. So, Bettina Marx, in her lovely introductory paper, said that Europe has lost its soul. And I would agree with that if I could assume that Europe ever had a soul. But I don't believe that Europe ever had a soul. What Europe has lost is its ability to outsource violence and suffering, its ability to extract resources without attracting immigrants and refugees. So, what we see at present is not an aberration in European history, it's the norm of European history simply brought closer to home. Rather than having the good grace to die in their own countries, Africans now insist on dying in the Mediterranean in a way that makes Europeans look and feel bad. And of course, we push back in a classically European way by making deals with governments and warlords in North Africa to keep the wretched, to keep those who are fleeing to Europe away from Europe, to pen them in Libya, to pen them in Morocco, to pen them in Egypt. In a way, I feel I should stop here, but I got paid to come, so I think I have to say a little bit more. So, what I don't want to say, I do not want to say that might is right. But what I do want to point out, and this is drawn from David Kennedy, is that speaking law to politics is not at all the same as speaking truth to power, especially when that law, as with human rights, was made by politics. So, public international law, which I have had the good and bad fortune to study alarmingly for 25 years now, um, it seems to me comes in two parts, two quite separate systems. And had I thought more before I submitted this paper, I would have given it a different title. This is the title which I will use if I write more about this, which I hope I will finally manage to offend those in the room that I haven't offended yet. This paper should be called Harry Potter and the Gluttonous Machine. Because it seems to me that human rights and Harry Potter have a lot in common. They both consist of a series of badly written childish fantasies, which are, for inexplicable reasons, popular around the globe. They both exist as a distraction from reality, as an escape. In both, we are to dream that a boy wizard with a scar on his head can save us from the world around us. Unfortunately, in this life, the wizard's wand is broken and he has no power. So there are, as I said, two international laws. There is the one that we like to talk about, human rights, the law of war, the law of sea, sources, treaties, etc. And what I find fascinating about that law is that we only ever find it important when it doesn't work. And I think that it actually precisely works by not working. So it sits in relation to another international law that we never talk about, the law of trade and resources, the law of oppression and exploitation. Since its inception, international law has been a colonial endeavor. It has existed to do two things. One is to remove wealth and resources from the non-European world and bring them to the European world. And the other is to justify that theft, to justify that plunder, and to naturalize it. So at the beginning, when we discovered the Americas, we drew a divide between those who were Christian and those who were heathen. We argued that the heathen were not like us, but they could become like us. They could reach salvation through the word of God, that therefore we had a duty to bring them to salvation or kill them trying, and they had a duty to come to salvation or die trying. And seeing as we were doing them a favor by saving their souls, it was only right that they should pay for it. So any resources that we picked up along the way were rightfully ours. We would repeat that process briefly in Africa under the guise of evolution, and then much more famously under the guise of civilization. There were those who were civilized and there were those who were uncivilized. The civilized had a duty to civilize the uncivilized had a duty to become civilized, and seeing as we were doing them a favor, they should pay for it. Therefore, any resources that we picked up along the way were rightfully ours. My argument essentially is that human rights law and law and development are the latest iteration of this move. We have a world divided between those who have rights and development and those who do not have rights and development. And we've developed this really peculiar discourse that says, in order to have development, you must have human rights. But you can't expect to have human rights if you are not already developed. And what you need instead is intervention, is tutelage, is correction. So once again, those who have must intervene in those who have not, must bring them to our standard or kill them trying. They must rise to our standard or die trying. And seeing as we are doing them a favor, they should pay for it. So any resources we find along the way are rightfully ours. Now, the problem with this machine is very simple. Is that it is gluttonous, it is rapacious. The Euro-American world, Europe, America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, accounts for roughly 15% of the global population and roughly 85% of global consumption. In other words, the lifestyle that we call modern, the lifestyle that we call developed, the lifestyle we call possessing human rights is an incredibly expensive lifestyle. It is only available to those who plunder from others. And the dream of a universal human rights, even if it were desirable, even if we should all be straight, secular, white European males, it is unavailable. We can't create a world where everyone is the thief and no one is the victim. So it seems to me that we have two choices, that we accept a world where the thieves preach to the victims about their own backwardness and barbarity, or we have a world where the thieves, the civilized, the modern, the rights bearers are challenged. But they cannot be challenged through human rights. And I think this, in part, was the point that Raif Sarik was making at the start, that human rights function to dissipate politics, to misdirect energy and the attention of resistance. They infantilize the oppressed, forcing them to turn to the superior civilization of their oppressors, whether manifested as judges or the ever-elusive international community. Within a neoliberal, neo-colonial world, these pleas cannot avail. The underlying machine of which they form part is not challenged and never will be challenged. We cannot attack the master's interests with the master's tools, and that exactly is why we were given those tools in the first place. Human rights, I'm sorry to say it, but they're a con to ensure passivity and the continuation of the status quo, and I'm going to stop. Thank you all very much.
شكرا جيسون.
Thanks a lot, Jason. I hope that the subject of hypocrisy, which we discussed, will one day change the hypocrisy among many parties. Now we will talk about Samira Smear's lecture. She will pick up from Jason Beckett's point by talking about an aspect related to it. Between War and Peace, Reflections on the Fate of Revolution in the Project of Human Rights. I am Samira Smear. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I will speak in Arabic after your permission. And I will start by posing a number of questions related to my intervention. What kind of political practice and political agency has the project of international human rights put forward? And what other political possibilities has it turned less admissible and therefore less imaginable? And how do these political operations of international human rights play out under conditions of colonial destruction? Uh, in order to answer this question, I would like to summarize my intervention as follows. Um, human the Human Rights Project has contracted the place of anti-colonial rebellion in international legal discourse. Um, the consolidation of the right of to self-determination has fostered a vision of politics at odds with decolonization as freedom, struggle slash rebellion. Before proceeding to establishing and clarifying this argument, a few clarifications are in order. Well, the self determination has enhanced struggle and rebellion, um, and the political and ethical possibilities will be discussed. Um, Before proceeding to establishing and clarifying this argument, a few clarifications are in order. First, in what follows, I take human rights to constitute a project. By this, I mean that in their different historical phases, human rights have constituted an intervention in social and political life, an assemblage of forces aimed at the remaking of moral and political sensibilities. This is not to say that there is no room for negotiation and creative interpretation within the project of human rights. It is rather to insist that human rights is a delimited discursive and institutional field within which different conflicting positions about what is human and what is human right and what is not, are made possible. To say that it is a project, then, is to inquire into the limits of this discursive and institutional field and its operations in the world. My second clarification: the contemporary hegemonic project of human rights, which grants rights to individuals even beyond the nation state, and which Sam Moyn historicized as emerging only in the 1970s, and which Stefan Hoffmann historicized as arising in the 1990s after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, is of course not the only vision of human rights we have had since 1948. Hoffman has argued that in the 1970s and 1980s, human rights coexisted and overlapped with other moral and political idioms like solidarity, and included competing notions of rights, which were in many ways still indebted to the legacies of socialism and anti-colonialism, as in, for example, the transnational movement against apartheid. Um, Third clarification: summing up the contemporary debates about human rights, we could say that they are about the tension between individual political rights from one side vs or versus collective social and economic rights, utopian human rights versus politicized human rights, ineffective and inefficient human rights versus imperialist and strong human rights, minimalist versus maximalist, and universalist versus culturalist or culturist approaches. My remarks today are less concerned with these important field defining dichotomies, but with another important debate concerning politics and their relationship to international law. It has it has been argued that the minimal set of individual human rights as tools to addressing suffering limit the horizons of thinkable political change, making less imaginable other more collective projects of addressing wrongs. In response, others have called for the politicization of human rights, removing them from lofty ideals of law and engaging them with murky politics, activating in turn their emancipatory potential. Hence, the call to transform human rights from anti politics to an openly partisan enterprise. This turn to politics appeals to me, but I am more specifically concerned with the kind of collective political agency enabled under conditions of colonial destruction. Hence, my questions again: how has the project of human rights and its different itineraries re-articulated the practice of politics under conditions of colonial destruction? What avenues of political action has it deemed admissible, and what others less imaginable? And how to understand the persistence of other non-human rights-centered political practices. To answer these questions, I first turn to the text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, originally drafted as the International Bill of Rights. The preamble to the 1948 International or Universal Declaration establishes a peculiar hierarchy between rebellion and human rights. It affirms that whereas it is essential if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. This preamble passage conveys two distinct characteristics of human rights. First, it conveys the political practices, including rebellion, that the project of human rights undoes in its unfolding in the world. So, that is to say that human rights do not only protect, they also overturn other political horizons of action. Second, the passage conveys the kind of action that the Declaration deems properly human. According to the Declaration, rebellion against oppression and tyranny is an act that individuals can only be compelled to pursue, and only once other choices have been exhausted. Rebellion descends upon the oppressed man from without, and he cannot refuse it. It is a force meaning rebellion, that takes over desperate men. Human rights, in turn, police against rebellion by prevailing in the law, and the human rights become the preferred weapon against two extremes, oppression and rebellion. And if rebellion is the space of compelled political action, human rights is the space of uncompelled, free, and authentic action against oppression and tyranny. Here we can begin to glimpse some of the reasons as to why human rights and international law more generally have become an alternative to revolutionary and rebellious action. Earlier drafts of the Declaration did not include this language about rebellion in the preamble. Most drafts included references to international cooperation, war, and peace. The reference to rebellion appeared for the first time, as far as I can tell, in a draft from June 1948. The original language was, quote unquote, where it is essential if mankind is not to be compelled as a last resort to rebel against tyranny and oppression, that human rights be protected by a regime of law, unquote. Fittingly, the UK requested the substitution of the rule of law for the regime of law. Cuba and Ecuador proposed a slightly different formulation that is worth citing. Quote, whereas it is essential if individuals and peoples are not to be compelled to rebel against tyranny and oppression, which would be their legitimate right, underlined, as a last resort, that human rights should be protected by a regime of law, unquote. But a few days later, they withdrew their proposal that marks rebellion as a legitimate right, and joined France in a proposal that would make it to the final text of the Declaration. Quote, whereas it is essential if man is not to be compelled to fall back as a last resort, on rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by a rule of law, unquote. The language was adopted in the final draft. The reference to rebellion as a legitimate right was dropped out. How to explain its temporary appearance and immediate disappearance of rebellion as a legitimate right? Why was rebellion at odds with 20th century international human rights? To answer these questions, it is necessary to contemplate the workings of the international stage from which international human rights were reached. The international dimension of this project um, is significant. Uh, However, today I would like to ask a question. What are the characteristics of the international scene? Uh, so I would like to talk about three characteristics. The first one talks about temporality. The second point talks about war and peace, and the third point talks about understanding the vision. I will talk about these 3 points. Temporarily, temporality. Sorry. When Bentham coined international, he meant it as the fixed space of relationships between states. But over the 19th and 20th centuries, the international stage expanded to include other non-European empires and states as part of the international family of nations, such as Japan and so on. The international stage or society began to signify a progressive overcoming of a Eurocentric past. The future became the further perfection of the present. This belief in the progress of the international society only intensified in the second part of the 20th century as more post colonies joined the Society of Nations, leading international relations theorists to reflect optimistically on the expansion of international society. International human action is therefore distinct from rebellious action, which interrupts time and looks for singular possibilities in its ruins in the midst of darkness and destitution. International human action is assured in itself, its progressive promise, and the world it can further perfect from the grounds of the present. Rebellious action, by contrast, is unclear about its future and yet attached to time and its risks. Of course, progressive temporality characterizes modern revolutions as well, but revolutionary temporality is nevertheless distinct from the linear temporality of international society, as it entails a radical break from the present, introducing perils, liabilities, and unforeseen possibilities. To use David Scott's formulation, revolutionary action is tragic, by which he means fragile, contingent, entailing collision in a field of power, unpredictable, and exposed to the risk of political affairs. This is why tragedy, according to Scott, might be the price of freedom. This might explain why, as long as international society was still expanding during decolonization from the 50s through the 80s, revolution and rebellions could still coexist and overlap with the project of human rights, and even occasionally overlap with it, as Hoffman argues. As long as international society was still in the making, as long as not all people belonged to international society, rebellious actions still had a place in the making of the world. This is when international society finally encompassed most peoples in the world that its sensibilities began to dominate it. It is then that the project of human rights began to fulfill its earlier promise to marginalize collective struggle and collective freedom and to form an international stage out of the pacification, elimination of local rebellions. In other words, the less inclusive international society, the more rebellious possibilities for world making existed. The more inclusive international society, the less universalization of the imagery and the practice of rebellion. 2. War and peace. The declarations problem space, like that of the UN Charter, is that of international peace. The preliminary draft from June 4, 1947, suggested the enunciation of four principles in or with regard to peace and war. The first states that there shall be no peace unless human rights and freedom are respected. The other, that there can be no human freedom or dignity unless war and the threat of war is abolished. A later draft asserted that there can't be any true peace unless human rights and freedoms are respected, and only by abolishing war and the threat of war can human dignity and freedom be assured to all humankind. The preamble of the final draft attributes the atrocities of the 20th century wars to the disregard and contempt to human rights. Still, the language of war and peace invoked in earlier draft found no explicit articulation in the final draft of the declaration. Instead, the declaration speaks of the development of friendly relations between nations and cooperation with the United Nations. That the language of war and peace or the language of war and peace later dropped from the final draft of the declaration. This does not mean that it did not or that it did inform it. If we consider that war and peace constitute one key problem space of international society more generally, then their mediation of the international human rights project becomes more urgent to analyze. The centrality of the problem space of war and peace is evident in the UN Charter, but also in the deliberations and the efforts leading to the founding of the UN. Furthermore, international law itself was conceived by Bentham and other jurists as the space of the codified relationship between different states governing relations of war and peace. The rise of a stage called the international, I might also add, was conditioned upon the pacification of rebellions that facilitated the formation of sovereign states, which in turn could join the family of nations. Distinct from rebellion, war in this tradition of legal internationalization is a sanctioned excess that remains after making rebellions impossible or illegal. This is in contradistinction from socialist internationalism, whose problem space is that of revolution across states, not war between states. Why is it important to note that the problem space of human rights is that of war and peace? First, in the pre-modern natural law tradition, and before the rise of the modern conception of an international view, Western theorists from Aquinas to Vattel spoke of war as encompassing rebellion. That is, jurists did not distinguish between intrastate rebellion and interstate war. Second, because this gradual diminishing of rebellion from the imagery of the international society is prevalent in other sites of international law. Consider the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions from 1977. In part, these were the culmination of efforts by states from the Eastern European bloc and the South, demanding that the revolutions of national liberation movements or wars of liberation be classified in international humanitarian law (IHL) as wars of self-determination or as international armed conflicts. They demanded the reclassification of their liberation revolutions, which were defined in the 1949 Geneva Conventions as non-international armed conflicts, as international armed conflicts. This was done for strategic and instrumental reasons having to do with protection for prisoners of war and what have you, but the result was the conceptual transformation of their revolutions into wars of self-determination, or in legal jargon, international armed conflicts. This testifies once again to the ways in which the discourse war has come to substitute the discourse of rebellion, diminishing along the way the discursive space for the latter. My aim today has been to show the power of operations of the project of human rights in a place like Palestine that continues to suffer colonial rule and colonial destruction, to offer some of the reasons as to why political sovereignty, through the realization of the right to self-determination, has become the sole avenue for emancipation and liberation, and how in official Palestinian discourse It longer overlaps with rebellion or even revolution. To conclude, therefore, I want to consider the third revolution of human rights, that is, rights that cannot be exerted by individuals but only collectively. These are also called solidarity rights. If the first generation offered freedom to individuals and states, this generation considers non state collectivities. Self determination is one such right, albeit a weak right. The principle of self determination declares that all people have the right to self determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Um, at issue in this conception of self determination is a futuristic project of developing the people economically, socially, and culturally. At issue is also the capturing the people as the object of its own intervention, as the subject and the object simultaneously, or in other words, at issue in its inward movement towards the self, not an outward movement against the other, if you will, a non relational decolonization. Already in this conception of self determination, there is tension between decolonization and self determination, even as self determination is conceived as a mechanism of decolonization. If decolonization might be about the undoing of relations of coloniality, self determination is about claiming an independent self and aspiring to develop on its own terms in the future. Self determination aspires to a future from the grounds of the past. Decolonization targets the past from the grounds of the present. The first is preoccupied with constructing a nation, and the other in destroying power relations. This is why it is possible today to conceive self determination without going through anti colonial struggle or rebellion. This is why it is imaginable that self determination is what leads to decolonization, not the opposite. Whether this is possible or not is not my concern. My concern is rather to point out and explain once again the demise of rebellion, including anti colonial rebellion, in the international project of human rights. To the extent that other political visions persist, they do so, and I want to suggest, despite the project of human rights signaling its failure to take on the so as Reinhard Roselek said, time consists of multiple layers that refer to each other in a reciprocal way, though without being fully dependent upon each other. The recognition of this sedimentation of time means contesting, as Wendy Brown argues, settled accounts of what time it is, what the times are, and what political tempo and temporarily we should hew to in political life. Hence the necessity to recall past, seemingly untimely, non-juridical meanings of decolonization, as indexing anti-colonial practices of struggle and political desires adequate to the possibilities of non-colonial rule. In this sense, decolonization is not demarcated in time past, and it is not limited to struggles of liberation in geographies classified by the United Nations as colonies. Uh, if the historical juridical meaning of decolonization unfolded on the international stage and in accordance to its vocabularies, decolonization as a series of interconnected struggles and rebellions expressed a desire to freedom that was less concerned with institutional processes. To get a taste of another flavor of anti colonial freedom, I will leave you um, with a few lines that best capture this aspiration of anti colonial struggle for freedom. They are from a recent work on Frantz Fanon. Fanon wishes the colonized Fanon wishes the colonized to be absolutely free, but that this is a freedom that has nothing to do with political sovereignty. Instead, for Fanon, each citizen should stand on their own feet and be able to look the enemy in the eye without trembling. I leave you with this image of a confrontation between colonizer and colonized, an image of rebellion that persists.
والمداخلة الأخيرة مع دكتور سعيد زيداني. و في تحول شوي رح يكون في المسار عندنا هون في نهاية الجلسة. بدنا نرجع نجرب
The program. Oh,
خطاب حقوق الإنسان اللي
to human rights. We will technically listen now to the lecture of Dr. Saeed Zidani about the achievement of freedom of human rights. Who are the foes and allies in the battle for the protection of human rights? After the last lecture, some people might think that human rights is actually a conspiracy, especially after that lecture. Some people might even become against human rights after hearing some of the previous lectures. I would like to speak in an objective, non-partial manner about who are the foes and who are the allies in the battle for the protection of human rights, as stipulated or based on the stipulation of the United or Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, of 1948. Who are the enemies and who are the friends? So, international human rights, as mentioned in these declarations, and the UDHR of 1948, and of course the preceding declarations and agreements that we know very well, have different orientations and aspirations. With the various differences, they look into human rights regardless of the one's gender, religion, political orientation, and so on. These were what was seen as human rights. Human beings are seen by these texts as an equal human. Human beings are all equal. And to govern people in an equal manner. This is the basic point. So why are there some foes to human rights? Some of these foes are as follows. All forms of authoritarian rulers who claim to possess the knowledge and virtue that the public lacks, authoritarian regimes, oppressive regimes, rulers, dictators, and so on. These repressive leaders claim to possess the knowledge and virtue that the public lacks. They think that they know the interests of people more than them. And they think that the normal people do not have the virtue or knowledge. And because normal people under such regimes, so-called, do not have the virtue or knowledge, and because these authoritarian rulers possess this knowledge about the well-being of the people, they claim to have an ethical upper hand and goodness, and they justify their authoritarianism, based on that, and they start passing political injustices. These enemies were and are still well known, are known and were known. these include fascists or nationalistic radicals or even fundamentalist religious groups. This is the second team of foes, actually: radical nationalists, religious fundamentalists, and proponents of the idea of racial superiority, who see that some races are better than others and so on. So they do not really believe in the rights of all. In such systems or under such regimes, humans have obligations without rights. They have obligations for the nation or for the country. The radical nationalists, such as fascists and religious fundamentalists, and the proponents of the idea of racial supremacy or superiority, are based on denying equal rights for all, based on the religion or nationality of people, whether they are Muslim or non-Muslim, the way they look at the other person's religion and so on. These are, fundamentalists, Nazis, and what have you. As for the people of racial superiority, they think that their race is superior to others. They deny rights for the men and women of other races, but they give their people the upper hand. An example is South Africa during the apartheid. The third group of human rights foes, or the foes to human rights, are some major states and okay, there could be also minorities which are fundamentalist religiously or nationally, groups that see that want to deny others the rights. Um, Many times the minorities suffer from problems, especially those which are radical religiously or nationally. And so, whether they are religiously or nationally radical, you see that many times they have a problematic view of human rights. For example, if you look at the Bedouins in the Negev, they are suffering from less rights and violations of rights by the state of Israel, but at the same time, the individuals inside these groups, especially women, are really suffering from violations of their rights uh, by their tribe or very traditional family, Bedouin family in the Negev. So minorities suffer this, as I said, they suffer it from two sides. If you're living as a minority or like person from a minority, you could be suffering this from double sides, internally and externally. Three are some major states and corporations, especially transnational corporations, which give priority to interests of economic and S over human rights. And number four of the foes are advocates of moral relativism who deny the existence of absolute or universal ethical values in principle. So, as I said, some major states and corporations, especially transnational corporations, give priority to interests, economic and so on, over human rights. So they put their interests above all and do not care about human rights. It seems that the absolute rights trump the interests. of those. So very influential companies and corporations, especially transnational ones, uh, undermine human rights, especially in poor and underdeveloped countries, for the interest of stronger, more influential countries. So this is the third list of enemies or foes to human rights. This is happening clearly in many countries in Africa and outside of Africa. Corporations such as transnational ones, supported by great or superior countries, are abusing or violating human rights. So as we said, the number one is all types of authoritarian rulers. Two is radical nationalists, religious fundamentalists, and proponents of racial superiority. Three are some major states and corporations which give priority to interests over human rights, especially in Africa and some Latin American countries. Four are the advocates of moral relativism, who deny the existence of absolute or universal ethical values. Also, you have parties which are biased to the values of Western Europe and the United States. These are countries that promote individualism, which some people in other societies are not quite keen of. Some cultures are into individualism, but others do not have an individualist orientation or approach to life. There are more collectivist societies. So this cultural relativism approach has done or destroyed many things. These are values that are different, values of individualism. Our culture is not like that. It is more of a collective culture and not individualistic. And therefore, uh, sometimes there are more traditional voices in our countries, and they do not see things from an individualistic point of view. Some Arab and non-Arab countries are now being affected negatively. For example, our view towards women is different than the Western view about women. For example, here in our society, the group or the family is more important than the individual. But in the United States, for example, it's more of the individual. Whereas in Latin America, the group or the family is more important than the person. So different. There's no right or wrong, but these are just different approaches to life. So we see constantly that Western Europe and the United States are trying to impose their values on us, and this is quite problematic. Finally, it is worth saying that the foes of human rights are not only in these five categories. The number one violators of Palestinian human rights is the Israeli occupation. And even even short-term occupations, such as in Iraq, have greatly led to the collapse of human rights. So the occupation really undermines human rights and affects whole generations. Countries suffer from this until today, and of course, Palestine is suffering from the ongoing occupation. So, hence the destruction of human rights in these countries. I have talked about the foes of human rights. From the first session, we have talked about the friends or allies of human rights. But now let me speak quickly about the friends of or allies of human rights, the credible allies of human rights for the protection of these rights. Who are these allies? One, the supporters of liberalism based on equality between all. This is the first group. Here we must distinguish between the liberalism, which is based on equality, and egalitarianism from one side, from the second side. The first one focuses on the free market and the rights of all. So, liberalism, which is based on equality, focuses on welfare, state, and the fair distribution of wealth and other things. In both cases, in the two of liberalism, in both states of liberalism, they call for the protection of human rights. So the liberalism based on equality is a good ally of human rights. Yes, we should not also forget that Human Rights Project is a liberalist project, and especially the liberalism which is based on equality. And this liberalism rose greatly after the Second World War of the past century. These are among the best allies for human rights and who exert tremendous efforts to support and protect human rights. And the liberalists always talk about human rights, self declaration, and so on. And the rights of groups also. Collective rights, and they actually move from there to individual rights. So they have a good approach regarding human rights. And this is a good approach. Move to the from the group to the individual. And that's how countries should see this, to call for the public's well-being. Yes, so the liberalist project calls for this, that every person is equal. The liberalist or liberal project started in the 18th century and continues until today. Of course, we know that there are different groups or wings, if you may, of the liberalists or of liberalism, but they are the main ally of human rights. I have one, or you have 1 minute, he said. She says. Just 2 minutes? Oh, okay. What can I do with 2 minutes? You can take 4 minutes if you need them. Ah, okay. Okay. Well, what I would like to say in the remaining 2 minutes is that the Palestinian situation sees 3 points. I feel like I haven't had enough time to cover. You can take 5 minutes. We can talk about this later. Okay. All right. I can talk about 3 main points. One, in the Palestinian and Arab situation, the human rights situation is that whether in Egypt or Palestine, despite its extraordinary situation and so on, we have repressive authoritarian rulers, and also radical fundamentalist Islamists. Neither the first group or nor the second group is upholding human rights. Neither Mahmoud Abbas is upholding the rule of law, nor Hamas is upholding or adhering to human rights. And so, groups which are keen on human rights, like our groups, are quite divided and dispersed. And we are not being able to sufficiently protect human rights, unfortunately. This is because there are authoritarian regimes from one side, such as in Egypt or Palestine, despite, of course, the extraordinary situation of Palestine, and the main opposition, which is Hamas or is Muslim Brotherhood in the case of Egypt, or the other Islamic forces that are wrestling in the political scene. These are both great foes for human rights. This is really sad, because both parties are not keen on human rights. This is why the democratic liberal forces are the only ones that can provide or protect human rights, but unfortunately, we are quite divided and dispersed. And in a way, reluctant, because both parties are quite powerful and they are in charge and battling, wrestling in that fierce political scene. Of course, the only extraordinary thing in Palestine is the presence of the occupation. We know the great cost of that since 1967. We're suffering from the ongoing violations by the Israeli occupation, and then the first and second intifadas, uprisals, have also affected. But today we have the PA, Palestinian Authority, which is also not very keen on or not very adherent of human rights. Third point, if we look at the Arab scene, it maybe the Tunisian scene is the only optimistic human rights situation. The reason could be one, societal homogeneity in this regard, and their liberalism, because because from the first days of Tunisian independence, their first president was a liberal, and liberalism was embedded in the different associations, courts, system of governance, and so on. This is why I see Tunisia as the only optimistic or the major optimistic scene. And we know that Ben Ali's days were dark from that point of view, but women and universities and the courts have received a far greater share than in all other Arab countries. And we saw how in Tunisia there was real transition towards democracy, where there was the protection of human rights and freedoms. The human rights starts from the internal front and then moves to the external. It shouldn't come from outside, but from inside the society first and foremost. I would like to also thank the organizers of this conference. Okay, let us take a number of questions, and then we give the chance to for the speakers to answer. Okay, we have a question there. Thanks to everyone. Oh, you want to take a photo of me? Fine. Okay, thanks everyone. There is an interesting pace in this conference. I have sympathy for your project or compassion, but I have several questions. Just to be, for the sake of being critical. First, um, with regard to rebellion, what is the space that rebellion should take? And then there are different kinds of resistance. What are the best forms to do it within the framework of human rights? At least under the occupation and colonization. Why is rebellion important? I'll t- it, People can sometimes change their governance without rebellion. So let us claim that rebellion is okay. Why? For example, when someone becomes an adult, it is important for someone to rebel in order to form one's character. What is the importance of rebelling or rebellion? Whether we can or cannot rebel, it's, well, the British, for example, do not have a lot of revolutions. Of course, they used violence against the Irish, but they didn't really do lots of revolutions to reach to their development. Another point is that sometimes rebellions could lead to a very high cost. Can you please summarize? Um, Many people are become interested in rebellions, like in the Syrian case, but you never know when it can stop. It can go on forever rebelling. So there are dangers on the from status quos and dangers from rebellions. I don't remember what was the last successful revolution, by the way. So with regard to rebellion, like what is the space of it, maximum space, and where would it lead? That was his question. Okay, now we are organizing the persons asking questions. هل هذا بخير؟ شكرا.
Questions for Professors Badi and Ismair. So, Reem and Samira, if I may, those were really wonderful and moving papers. I have a sort of a tangential question, Reem, so feel free to ignore if it doesn't touch on your area of interest. But you were talking about the Chinese and Lebanese representatives, and they were emphasizing that they needed to identify what it is that makes us unique as a species. And so that really interested me. And then they thought that dignity makes us unique as a species. How did they then understand other species? And what did they mean by dignity if they thought that other animals didn't have it? And I know that's not what you were talking about, and I loved your paper, but in case you had any information, I'd be interested in knowing about that. For Samira's paper, that's just such an amazing and important project, and I'm so glad you're doing it, to trace the history of the loss of the ability to rebel alongside the history of the rise of human rights. And it reminded me a little bit about this important book that George Abisab wrote in the 70s, trying to say wars of rebellion are different from other types of wars. As the laws of the use of force were developing, he wanted to make sure that was not lost, because all of international law sort of rebels in a way against anything that is non-linear in space, non-linear in time, that is disorderly. And it wasn't just happening in human rights law, but in other areas of law as well, to exclude this idea. And so I was thinking there's that history of third world international lawyers who tried to do that, but there's also, I have a colleague at the American University who looks at how the same thing that you describe happens in Sharia law and how rebellion is dealt with from through the caliphates and all of that, the rise and the management of rebellion in other legal systems. And if you'd looked at that and sort of compared them, or if you had any ideas about how other legal systems deal with order and disorder.
Thank you. تفضل.
Can I ask it in English?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is directed to Reem and Jason. So I think we all agree that human rights was and isn't universal because its foundation is primarily racist, and it's intentionally claimed to be universal because it effectively marginalizes minorities. So the reason why when the charter came out in the 40s, when and it didn't mind Israel or apartheid South Africa or the massacre of indigenous populations is because the conceptualizing of racism as a concept was Eurocentric, and it came post the Holocaust, and so it was kind of pinned. The racism was pinned to a group of people inside Europe that were white. So anything outside Europe in the colonial world wasn't necessarily considered racist or racism. So we find that the organizing, or that we conclude that the organizing principle of many institutions, organizations, and actions is race. So race is the organizing principle. So my question, because Professor Basket said it cannot be universal, can we change the fact that race is an organizing principle? And if we can then human rights be universal? Thank you.
صبايا في ورا الست والأستاذ.
شكرا. مرحبا. سمية.
سمية عودة. I have the background of human rights from the 80s and 90s. I have worked in that. Of course, human rights was being looked at differently in the 80s and 90s, regardless of the international conventions. I have heard many different opinions from the beginning of the day. But it seems that after all these discussions, the terms related to human rights should be better defined. That's because human rights seem to be understood in different ways. And therefore, human rights might have been misused by the thieves in order to justify their crimes and their theft of the other nations' resources and so on. So you see the abuse taking place. And so some countries are seeing it in a very negative fashion. So Saeed was talking about the foes. We can add to the list of foes some other groups, such as the thieves who steal the properties and resources of other nations and so on. So other lists of foes could be mentioned there. Mr. Saeed, I couldn't understand what is the liberal system based on equality, like who, for example? And so if is it a system based on capitalism or not? We know that many times capitalists have misused the whole human rights thing in order to further colonize and abuse nations uh, and utilize the resources of occupied nations. So, can you please give us examples of the liberals you were talking about? Liberals based on equality, as mentioned in the last intervention. Shukran.
Thank you so much. It was so rich. I'd love to read it. I had a question. I wasn't sure whether you were saying the absence of the right to rebellion in the Universal Declaration. You were raising that as a criticism. I just wondered whether you would have preferred to see it in or not. It just occurred to me. I mean, surely shouldn't revolution and rebellion be extra legal? Why should there be a legal right to that? Isn't that a contradiction? Thank you.
مساء الخير.
Good evening or good afternoon. I would like to thank all those who have talked. Yes, so my question is about human rights. Even though these were written, the Universal Declaration was written in 1948, I think that the various aspects of this should have been tackled in a better fashion. So before coming to this event, I have seen that everything that has been discussed by your papers were answers to the questions that I had. Your papers were excellent, so they managed to answer all my questions. So the organization, the question is, are all the organizations pretending to be keen on human rights loyal to the concept of human rights? So after 70 years, is there a revisiting of this declaration every once in a while? That's question number 2, meaning the revisiting or even amendment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the first question was, are these organizations loyal? And 2, are these is the implementation of these principles being done correctly? And the third question, when will double standards stop? When will we stop the hypocrisy and trick deception? Yes. Another thing is that rights are not given, they are simply taken. And thanks a lot.
I don't know, shall we continue some more questions? Another round, or shall we answer?
سؤالي للست ريم حكت سؤالي للست ريم حكت
Reem, you have spoken about dignity, which does not apply the disparity or the distinction between South Africa and Palestine. Is this part of the of not having dignity that's a problem, in that the lack of dignity, and Africa did accept the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? about the dichotomy between South Africa and Palestine. They're speaking about deception and hypocrisy and people that will be uprooted. So, what is your comment on that? We will take another round of questions after we get answers so far. Thank you, Mira. To Saeed, our teacher, considering the Arab liberals, their concept, the opinion is based on Arab liberals. Is it a theoretical schematic issue, or is it based on reading reality, the reality on the ground? Concerning my limited knowledge that in Egypt and to some extent Palestine, you have pointed out that among the political rights are the basic concepts in Arab liberalism on the issue of the outcome of elections, which is accepted on minorities. In both cases, the liberalism were the first to reject the results of the elections, and in Egypt they have supported the slaughtering for the person who has gained the elections. If you can comment on that. Let's take some rebuttals. We start with Dear Reem, and then we move.
I'll respond, I think, most directly to the question. Can we change the fact that race is an organizing principle? And if not, can human rights be universal? Wow, what a great question. Thank you so much for that question. Maybe I'll respond to it in this way, if you don't mind. And it's not fully directly, but I hope maybe responds to other questions as well. So I'm a skeptic about human rights in this sense. I'm skeptical about the text. If you look at the Universal Declaration, there's nothing about water in there. I'm skeptical about human rights institutions. They follow politics and economic interests. I'm skeptical about the people in the institutions. They come from a particular segment of society and they have understandings about the way in which we live, and those understandings are often presented as universal when in fact they're particular to a social position. But there's one thing that I cannot give up about human rights, and that is all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. And why was that articulated as humans versus animals? I mean, it's not really spelled out in the drafting history, but it was an attempt to find something that distinguished not necessarily just distinguished human beings, but that drew us all together as human beings. And I'm really reluctant to give up on that idea, not because I'm so invested in human rights as an institution, but I just wonder, what do our social relations look like if we don't have that? How do we imagine our social relations? What kind of political orders can we strive for if we don't have that idea embedded in how we treat each other and the kinds of institutions that we build, or that are built, or that we rebel against if we haven't built them? And so that's the sense in which I think human rights can be universal. Obviously, that's a complex statement, but that's the sense in which I think the Universal Declaration has the tension of being simultaneously universal and racist at the same time. And I think we're actually at a moment in history where those tensions that were hidden, that were clear when they were being drafted, at least to the drafters, but then were hidden for a while, have now reemerged. And I think we have a choice in front of us. And my choice would be actually more human rights, not in the sense of, again, institutionalized, but more in the sense of more civic engagement around human rights. And that's where I really found Samira's paper really just, I think, hit the mark right on the head. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my thought.
Thank you, Reem. Jason?
Um, I'll start with the second question. And my very short answer is no.
الجواب المباشر لا. الجواب لا، كلا. وهنالك آه، رد أكثر تفصيلا بأن هنالك ثمة انتهاز وعنصرية في الوهلة الأولى، أو ربما الجندرية، النوع الاجتماعي، الختم من خلال كندي في الكتاب. كندي يحاول أن يفصل التفكير ذات الطابع العنصري، ويتردد يعود دوما لأن العنصرية الدافع المباشر لها كان عملية الانتهاز، وهي على الرغم من ذلك مبدأ ذات طابع تنظيمي. يجي كنت يعني عندي لهفة لمعرفة وأن نرد هل الصين فكروا بنفس الطريقة تجاه الأفارقة.
And I'm really struck by the Fanon's categorization of the native as a machine, animal, man. That the human comes third. So the spatial divide somehow sits above the native, which would also make sense of what you were saying about Malik's later interventions in Lebanon itself. So Zina, as you said, I don't think IHRL was ever intended to be universal. I do think it can be universal. The sort of remnants of the Marxist in me say, yes, there's a way of universalizing this. But it comes with an interesting cost. It comes at the cost that people like you and I and everyone in this room take a very significant drop in our standards of living. So we cannot live in a world where everyone gets to be the thief and no one gets to be stolen from. So if we want to think through dignity and equality, I think again it ties back to exploitation, and it has to be done from a standard of what people are starting to call de-development. But this leads me to two other points that have fascinated me. Someone at the back asked that we define our terms better, that human rights were being understood in different ways and they were being misused by the thieves. And someone else spoke about capitalists misusing rights. And I think this is completely back to front. I think this is completely upside down. If you look at the history of rights discourse, the key figures really, Thomas Hobbes, but it was an accident. He was a royalist. He didn't believe in equality. Then you have Grotius and Locke. So Locke, the slave-owning proponent of equality, seems a very odd place to start. And Grotius is trying to justify the foundation of the rising Dutch slave-based empire. I think I said this in my paper, I think human rights are doing exactly what they're meant to do. We've bought a really dodgy PR line. I mean, we're at the same level as white working class Americans that voted for Trump. We've just bought a lie and we're refusing to give up on it. So this discourse always meant the equality of a particular group of rich white men justifying the inequality of everyone else. So the thieves don't misuse rights, the thieves use rights. The capitalists don't misuse rights, the capitalists use rights. it's those of us who are looking for progressive politics. We're the ones that are either misusing rights or being misused, misled by rights. Um, and then that wonderful final question: when will the double standards stop? Um, when you colonize the Europeans, subject them to 600 years of absolute hell, and then say everything can be quits then.
Thank you, Jason. Samira?
I will start from a different angle. I mean, I will shift the question upside down. I do not think that the project of human rights is hypocritical or a conspiracy. Uh, it is intact. It could be intact, well-rounded, but I want to minimize the real purposes behind it. The interference in political horizons and practicing on the ground, no more, no less. It is not conspiracy or hypocritical. It's a project, but we have to understand the details in order to know the answers, to diagnose the problem. ومن ثم سأنتقل لسؤالك. شكرا يا رالف على هذا ومع ذلك فإنني أصبو إلى الحقيقة وكيف نظهر بأن الرواية بأن هنالك ثمة آفاق تلوح في الأفق.
Hierarchy that is established, but not about the legality or illegality of rebellion. I would like for rebellion, and for that matter for revolution, but it's too late for that, to remain extra legal. So that's if you, because for different reasons now that I don't want to go into them, for reasons that have to do with the distinction between rebellion, disobedience, revolution, treason, if we go even back in history. So for different reasons that we can dwell upon, but it's my aspiration is not to legalize rebellion. And so thank you so much for asking this question. And it's precise, and it leads to the question about other traditions of rebellion. And so this is part of a larger book project that has nothing to do with human rights, and that has to do with various rebellious moments in the history of Palestine, starting with 1834, a rebellion against Ibrahim Pasha, who occupied Bilad al-Sham at the time, and then Palestinians and others in Syria as well, in larger Syria, rebelled against his conscription order. The conceptual apparatus there, the operative one, was not revolution. Revolution was yet to be translated into Arabic to begin with. Until the 60s, it gets translated into Arabic, the 1860s, I mean. The Ottoman conceptual language is one of isyan and fitna. But there, unlike the modern revolutionary discourse, it's not about constituting a new legal order. It's actually about opposing the sultan, opposing the khedive, opposing the person in power. It's also not a logic of statehood. It's an anti-state, at least that 1834 rebellion in my reading was an anti-state project, an anti-modern state practice. So yes, and it's a longer story about meanings of isyan and fitna, and I know Khalid Abul Fadl has written this amazing work on the sort of classical period in Islamic law, and we're still awaiting for more works that take up these discussions to the 19th century before the rise of sort of the universalization of the logic of the nation state in the Middle East and in other parts of the world. So, so this then leads me to, I think, Raif's questions. And to just say تمرد is the way rebellion أو تمرد هو كيف ترجموا rebellion للعربي. فبالإنجليزي هي rebellion مش يعني تمرد هو rebellion. وأنا بفهمي إنه rebellion ومش revolution.
Rebellion and not revolution. Western countries have changed the terms. You know that this is an internal kind of.
هو كل السؤال ما يتبقى من المحاضرة
Your question
أنا ما وصلت
of what remains in the presentation to get from two different angles from the laws of war, and it became of international confrontations, wars later on.
واتهم حماس بجرائم حرب
And when there was the report calling Hamas activity as the pacification of rebellion,
الشيء اللي هو مؤسس للمنظر الدولي أكثر من
which is more of initiative on the international podium.
هذا الموضوع
So this opened
مش عارفة أنا
the right of groups to rebel. I do not know what is exactly, from a legal point of view, consensus, and we refer to terms
عارف وين مؤسسته القانونية
that we have to make use of some of the participants.
صارت
The-
حروب زي حروب
that in the 70s it acquired the character of war, and it started to have references of war bylaws and the right of armed resistance. We don't know where to place it. This is open for debate.
ليش التمرد مهم؟
Why rebellion is important?
واقع سياسي معين عشان نفكر
I'm speaking from a specific political, not in an abstract way. And to see the destiny of these different moments, the divergences.
كمان مهم
It is also pertinent
مواطن أو subject
that there is subject pressure
عن ذات اللي بس بتطالب
on the set that requires only demands, makes demands.
فيها دائما نوع من الاحتكار
There is always like monopoly, and this came in your intervention. Last but not least,
مش معناه انه الممارسه العنيفه بتروح لما قمنا مصطلح التمرد للقانون الدولي
it is not that the concept of removing the thing from the international. It takes the course of a war, which is the legitimization that we have in hand, which is non-international kind of confrontations. And there aren't the destruction which is there, but the law deals as if they are in a parity course. When there is an imbalance which is striking, the technologies of destruction, there is no parity between national liberation movements and the imbalance in this balance of forces, that you have war and then you have rebellion, and leads a change from such a course of that war, like the high contracting powers. That also there is a divergence between rebellion and war, and there is an asymmetry that is remarkable. And this leads to a different course, so it is a relationship of asymmetry, imbalance. At the end, I feel sleepy, but like bullet points. The lips have to be in the right place. The issue that surfaced here, we have to think together and earnestly how we can market and promote human rights. Is it a metaphysical kind of philosophical outlook. The issue of dignity, humanity, which is well entrenched equality. This is a metaphysical issue. Are we in need, in order to promote human rights, this mythological thing, that we build the belief that we can promote and justify pragmatically the issue of human rights based on the human experience and the catastrophes that happened in the First World War and Second and slavery and what have you. Based on this accumulated experience, the rights that are agreed upon in a distinctive way. So we say something to encounter that and avoid it. This is a pragmatic justification. It is not a metaphysical thing. It is like rationalization in order to derive, the lessons from this. Another thing, it is clear historically, conceptually, that human rights on this inventory of human rights is a legitimate child for the concept of neoliberalism. From Locke and Hobbes and Hume, the socialist camp had a different facade. But the liberalism is to say that everybody is equal. And liberalism, as I said, basically entrenched, not the savage kind of liberalism based on freedom. I'm speaking about the state kind of achievements that are based on liberalism of the state of prosperity. It does not require the intervention in order to rectify and redistribute the sources of wealth. Another question. If you look whether in Egypt or Palestine, this to Islah, that's the situation we have. There are Islamic forces and human rights, and we have oppressive leaders with different grades, and we are lost in between. We are helpless. One is trembling in front of the authority, the other is between Islamists. So the idea of equal citizen rights is distant from the scene. So you have Islamic irredentists from one side, and so we became dispersed and fragmented, where we are somewhat far from equal, from equality. The last point, from Raif to Jason to other participants, there are two aspects. We need to differentiate between them. The universality of human rights that apply on every person, wherever and whenever. And the second question, in these debates, there is an international context and we have to differentiate. Do they fit and complement each other, or are they distinct? But at least, in a schematic level, we should differentiate. Human rights has to do with members as individual or between the establishment and us. It is not my human rights with the United States or Canada or the foreign company and or local company. It has to do within an international context, I'm saying. And we should look at it earnestly. But the backbone, from its nascence, there is a relation between people within the given state or the given society and the relevant authority. This is the pattern in the relationship. The other issues are perceived in a different. So there is a difference between the globality of human rights, or to look at it from a global perspective, and we should differentiate between the two outlooks. There were two questions I promised. Part two is the second session is over.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.